Hello, and welcome to the Poison Paint Factory. My factory designated name is Poison226. Nice to meet you. Through your moonlit curtain, a cold wind cuts through the shadows, but it's not this that tears you from your dreams. The faint echoes of waves striking the coast sound eerily like leathery wings beating an erratic heartbeat. A beast calls out for its lost master, and the gnawing sensation of dread turns your spine to ice. The shadows seem to move of their own accord, and they take on an unnatural mass. Pinned to your bed by fear, the sheets become heavy and a scream, your scream, claws at the fleshy cavern of your throat to escape, only to choke and die before it's born. And then you see him. He has the beauty of Adonis, a demeanour calm like the surface of a lake. Darkness and lust intertwine his soul. You can see in his eyes, his hypnotic eyes. You give yourself to him freely as you pass out, only to wake with the morning sun on your skin and the odd feeling of emptiness. An uncomfortable sting settles on your bare flesh as floating dust motes dance in particular ways. What is a vampire, and how do I become one? Was Dracula really that bad, or was he just misunderstood? And what if Dracula defeated Van Helsing? What would happen next? Welcome, my sweet children of the night. Tonight, I want to talk about Dracula. Grab your cross, cape, and canines, my baby bats, because things are about to get spooky. Disclaimer, a lot of the information presented in this video is public information that I researched alongside my interpretations and opinions. Sources will be linked in the description, and yes, there will be spoilers. So with all that said, let's get to it. Who or what is Dracula? We all know this one. Dracula looks like this, or this, and even this. He has many different looks, but it always comes back to a hot topic wardrobe, sexy fangs, and an intense look in his eyes. And this is the gentleman we're going to be focusing on today. This is Dracula. Dracula is a vampire. Surprise! Vampires are a type of undead, but not the decaying or mouldy kind like zombies. No, we're talking fangs, eternal life, sexy gothic kind of undead. Everyone knows this, but it would be remiss of me not to mention it. The fictitious Count Dracula was inspired by the very real Vlad Dracul III, aka Vlad Tepes, aka Vlad the Impaler. Fictitious Dracula is a handsome, well-spoken man. He has enlarged canines to bite his victims and drink their blood, as he can't eat regular food. He sleeps all day and only comes out at night. As for powers, he is strong, fast, and wealthy. No, seriously, I'm counting that as a power. He can hypnotize people with a gaze, and can control them over great distances through telekinesis. He's smarter than the average human, and can wield dark magics and control the weather. He can also shapeshift into mist and various animals such as rats, wolves, and bats, and even climb on walls like a lizard. Oh, and the small thing about being able to live forever by consuming blood or whatever. So what about his weaknesses? Dracula does not like religious symbols, especially the crucifix. Or garlic. Don't forget garlic. Sunlight doesn't hurt him, but it does make his powers weak, and if the sun rises while he's shapeshifted, he's stuck in that form for the rest of the day. He's a gentleman and must be invited into someone's home. He can also pass through cracks in walls, but can't cross barriers made of holy wafers or running water, unless the tide is at the highest or lowest levels. Finally, his sleeping habits make him predictable. He must sleep on the soil of his native land, or he will become weak. Unfortunately for the Count, there is a way he is able to die too. In the novel, Dracula is decapitated and stabbed in the heart, which makes his body crumble and turn to dust. Generally, vampires can be destroyed by being incinerated, immersed in running water, shot with a sanctified bullet, having their heart pierced, or getting beheaded. While the most common tool is a wooden stake, iron blades can also be used, in reference to the myths where iron harms supernatural beings. However, the adaptations tend to neglect this notion. A lot of Dracula's monstrous traits can be pointed to in medical journals as genuine illnesses. 3 of such are rabies. This is transmitted via bites or blood-to-blood contact. It causes symptoms such as anxiety, confusion, agitation, insomnia, hallucinations, and abnormal behaviour. Rabies generally kills due to suffocation or cardiorespiratory arrest. But what is interesting is the body might actually look somewhat vampiric in death, with hemorrhages and slower decomposition. PCT. Patient has thin or fragile skin, which can almost look transparent. They are incredibly sensitive to light and may even suffer with receding gums, giving them a vampiric smile. There is a bunch of really nasty side effects that I won't detail here, but the patient would look to be a bit like a really old person in very poor health. Traditional treatment methods included drinking the blood of others to try and boost their red cell count, along with hiding from the sun, of course. TB. Patients lose weight, become physically weak, suffer from fevers, and cough up blood. TB can be transmitted quite easily, so a patient spending any length of time with someone else may infect them too. They say fact can be stranger than fiction, and in this case, it would seem that some of these medical facts were woven into fiction, with a result much more menacing than anyone could have predicted. Abraham Bram Stoker was born on November 8, 1847, in Clontarf on the outskirts of Dublin, Ireland. Bram was a sickly child, being frequently bedbound and subject to regular bloodletting. He was not expected to live into adulthood. He received a Bachelor and Master of Art degree before managing London's Lyceum Theatre for most of his adult life. Bram began working on Dracula in 1890, originally titled The Undead, and the Count, hailing from Austria, being referred to as a vampire. This was until Bram came across the name Dracula in the Whitby Library while on vacation. Contrary to popular misconception, Dracula received mostly positive reviews at the time. Of the 87 newspaper and journal reviews of Dracula, 70 rated positive, 3 rated negative, and 14 were mixed. If this was a Netflix rating, it would be 3 thumbs and a paperclip out of potato. Other than Dracula, he also wrote The Snake's Pass, The Mystery of the Sea, The Jewel of 7 Stars, The Lair of the White Worm, and The Lady of the Shroud, just to name a few. None came close to the popularity of Dracula, but it is one of the most successful novels in history, and as I haven't read any of the others, I can't really comment on them. Bram Stoker regrettably passed away on April 20th, 1912 in London, aged 64. So we've discussed the man and the monster, but what about the media portrayals? Let's look at some in release order. In 1897, Bram submitted the stage play for Dracula to protect the dramatic rights of his book, basically old school copyright. Dracula was then performed at the Lyceum Theatre in London on 18th of May 1897, in the morning. This was 8 days prior to the novel being published, so there wasn't a great deal of hype for the play. I say play, but it was more of a dramatic reading rather than a performance. It was typical to only advertise these readings 30 minutes prior to the curtain being raised, and so there was an audience grand total of No, just 2. I can imagine that being a lonely, harrowing 6 hours they'll never get back. Oh, I'm not even joking. In its pre-published state, it was estimated to take 6 hours to read. Ah, now the morning start seems to make sense. In the play, Edith Craig portrayed Mina. She was an important member of the women's suffrage movement in England. Henry Ivan, who was Stoker's inspiration for Dracula, was not a part of the play though. He allegedly gave Stoker a one-word review when asked. He responded, "Dreadful." Dracula was published on 16th of May 1897 by Archibald Constable and Company and cost 6 shillings. The book is written as a series of diary entries and letters from 4 different points of view. The protagonists are Jonathan Harker, a solicitor, Wilhelmina Mina Murray, who becomes Jonathan's wife, Dr. John Seward, who is in charge of the local psychiatric hospital, and Lucy Westenra, the free-spirited friend of Mina. The book starts by informing the reader that these papers have been placed in sequence and all needless matter has been eliminated, thereby explaining why the novel has only relevant information to the story and why it can be read in sequential manner. It makes sense because it has been made to make sense. If you think of it in terms of movies, it's like Blair Witch or Paranormal Activity. It's the found footage of its time. The novel begins with Jonathan Harker travelling to Castle Dracula in order to sell Dracula a property in England. Harker is warned by the locals of the evils of Castle Dracula and not to travel at night, but he continues, albeit more cautiously, to the Borgo Pass, where he is collected by a coach. At one point, the coach is attacked by a pack of wolves, but the coachman mysteriously commands them to leave. At the castle, Harker meets Count Dracula for the first time and finds him strange. Later, Harker is startled when the Count casts no reflection in his mirror. He cuts himself shaving. Upon seeing the blood, the Count lunges at Harker like a man possessed, but calms instantly when seeing Harker's crucifix. Harker soon realises he is a prisoner within the castle, and he is attacked by Dracula's brides. The Count saves him and feeds the women a baby. Harker passes out and awakens back in the guest room as if nothing happened. Harker sees the Count climb the castle walls like a lizard and also discovers the Count survives by drinking human blood. Harker attacks the Count while he's sleeping, only managing to graze the Count's forehead with a shovel. Harker is left sick, weak, and alone in the castle as the Count leaves with 50 boxes of earth to go check out his new crib. Or is that crypt? The novel switches focus and we're in England now. Harker's fiancée, Mina, visits her friend Lucy, who is engaged to Arthur Homewood after being involved in a bit of a love square with Dr. Seward, Quincy Morris and Arthur. A ship lands at Whitby Beach. A large dog is the only survivor and the only cargo is 50 boxes of Transylvanian dirt. Later, Lucy is sleepwalking and when Mina finds her, she spots something hovering above before it vanishes. Lucy remembers nothing when she wakes, and Mina sees 2 red marks on her neck. Lucy's health deteriorates over the next few weeks. Mina finally hears from Harker and leaves to go nurse him better. Lucy's condition worsens, and Dr. Seward contacts Dr. Van Helsing for help. Lucy needs regular blood transfusions, which improves her condition. Van Helsing decides to fill Lucy's room with garlic, which is obviously to keep vampires away. Dracula attacks Lucy again as a wolf and kills her mother through fright. Van Helsing calls on her fiancé Arthur as Lucy is close to death, but when he arrives, Lucy attacks him. Van Helsing saves Arthur and Lucy dies. Later, newspapers report on the Bloofer lady, who has been attacking children. Van Helsing and Dr. Seward decide to examine Lucy's coffin. Meanwhile, Mina and Harker marry and return to England. Van Helsing gets the gang back together to tell them Lucy is now a vampire and how to save her soul. Somehow he convinces the men to drive a stake through her heart, decapitate her and stuff her face full of garlic. One vamp down, one more to go. If the gang can find and destroy all 50 boxes of Dracula's dirt, the vampire will be vulnerable. Van Helsing and Seward break into Mina's room one night and find her drinking blood from an open wound on Dracula's chest. Dracula promptly disappears. All but one of the boxes are found and destroyed, and with a bit of sleuthing, they find out that the last one has been shipped back to Dracula's castle. Because Mina is now linked to Dracula through his blood, the gang hypnotise her and find out where Dracula is, and follow him all the way back to the Borgo Pass, where he's been transported in the final crate of dirt by a group of gypsies. They defeat the bad guys, unpack Dracula like I do a box of minis, and between Harker and Quincy, they take a little off the top and practice some open heart surgery on the vampire scourge. Dracula is dust. Quincy falls victim to his fatal wound, and that's the final curtain. Was the book controversial? Well, no, not really. It had controversial topics like sexuality, the baby and child killings, but where the characters were concerned, they were actually quite common tropes of the day. Mina is a typical Victorian woman, and Lucy was more liberal by comparison, especially where her love life was concerned. But none of the characters other than Dracula were groundbreaking in their personalities. Well, with the exception of one gentleman. Renfield is one of my favourite characters. He is important to the novel, even if I can sum up the story without mentioning him once. He is a somewhat willing slave to Dracula, who he hopes will bestow him with eternal life. He sees vampirism not as consuming blood, but as consuming souls. Renfield is gifted flies to consume, then spiders, who, in Renfield's world, count as more souls and therefore more life, because they've consumed the souls of many flies, and so on and so forth. I find him interesting because of his madness, his role as willing servant to the abuser, and his purpose in the novel, which is to give context to the reader of what vampires are and what they can do. He is a vehicle in which the reader can understand the bigger picture. One day I hope to do a full video on Renfield, especially with the recent new movie release. But for now this will have to do. Well, yes, he is that bad. He controls people against their will, he wants to spread the vampire virus around the world, and he kills babies. Can we stop with the anti-hero rhetoric? All the good he does is for his own gain later. He is very obviously a megalomaniac and sociopath at best. At worst, well, let's put it this way. His father was nicknamed Dracul, which translates to the dragon. So Dracula technically means son of the dragon, notwithstanding what he did to my poor Renfield. That is unforgivable. So for that alone he's going on the naughty list. Dracula as a novel is fine. My first impression was that it was pretty good, but a second read is much more difficult than the first for me. It is quite an easy read as far as classical literature goes, with language kept relatively simple and easy to understand. The characters are great, and the overall story is fun and interesting, albeit a little muddled in places. I think the book has remained relevant in the public eye for so long because the Count is so iconic. And there is a belfry bursting with Dracula media out there, and within that there is something for everyone. Oh, did you know that there is more than one book in the Dracula series? No, I mean officially part of the series. Dacrestoker, the great-grandnephew of Bram, along with co-authors, have written 4 books to flesh out the Dracula timeline. Dracula the Undead was released in 2009 and is a sequel to the original novel. Dracul in 2018, which is the prequel to Dracula with Bram Stoker as the central character. As for the Stokerverse, as they call it, part written story, part graphic novel, they released all 74 pages of The Virgin's Embrace in 2021, and the much longer 166 pages of Dracula's Bedlam in the same year. Was Dracula the first Universal horror movie? No. That title would go to The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1913. Was Dracula the last Universal horror movie made? Nope. That title is yet to be awarded, as Universal is still producing horror films to date. What makes Dracula so culturally important? Well, it has the rare honour of being the film that started and ended an era, that being the end of the 1920s Lon Chaney era and the beginning of the classic era of Universal horror. The original Universal Dracula movie is the film adaptation of the 1924 British stage play by Hamilton Dean, which was then revised in 1927 by John L. Balderston, and was the only official stage performance authorised by Stoker's widow. The movie was directed and co-produced by Ted Browning and Karl Freund. The screenplay was written by Garrett Thorpe, and the starring role was performed by Bela Lugosi. The other characters were David Manners as John Harker, Helen Chandler as Mina Seward, Dwight Fry as R.M. Renfield, and Edward von Sloan as Professor Van Helsing. The film had a budget of just under $350,000 and supposedly made Universal $700,000 in profit. Let's start from the beginning with one of the biggest changes. It is Renfield who goes to Transylvania and not Harker, but for the most part this introduction plays out closely to the novel. The next change is, instead of Harker escaping the castle after Dracula heads to England alone, Renfield actively sides with Dracula, and they leave on the ship together. When the ship docks in Whitby, the crew are all dead and Renfield is alone, completely mad. Dracula is obviously peckish, after only having sailors to chomp down on. So he decides to grab a quick bite in London, in the shape of a flower girl. The police find her body straight away. He's not even trying to hide what he's done. Again, in the book there is no feeding on anyone outside of the main cast, so all this scene does is add to the horror and body count. Jason would be pleased. Another main difference, probably for pacing, is after Dracula bites Lucy, there isn't a prolonged illness, she just dies. In one of the strangest changes, Dracula just turns up at Mina's house. He's introduced to Van Helsing, who he says he knows already. Dracula's reflection doesn't show in a cigarette box, and when confronted by this, he knocks it out of Van Helsing's hand, apologises, and then leaves. When everyone discusses Dracula being a vampire, the hero of the movie Renfield enters, and tries to advise sending Mina away. A bat spooks him, a maid rushes in, and everyone leaves. The maid faints and Renfield suddenly looks like he's progressing from animals to humans. Not quite so heroic. A lady in white is mentioned in passing, but this storyline isn't followed up on like in the book. After this in the film, Mina talks of seeing Lucy and breaks up with Harker, which definitely didn't happen in the book. Mina has wolfbane all over a room like in the novel, but Harker decides that he wants to leave with Mina. Helsing is talking with him about putting a stake in Dracula's heart when Renfield enters saying it's a strange conversation for sane men to have. Which, I mean, he has a point. Renfield talks about seeing Dracula with thousands of rats. Give or take, the film now follows the main beats of the book, with the gang hunting down Dracula to kill him. Dracula's death is different in the film though, as Van Helsing simply stabs a stake through his heart while he's sleeping in his coffin. Renfield sadly did not make it to the end of the film either, as Dracula killed him earlier. As you can tell, the film adaptation is a lot more concise, and I think that it does a really good job of keeping the spirit of the original novel, but injects enough of its own personality and originality to keep the lore understandable, and gives the story a more natural flow. If you watch the movie now, you might find it a little disturbing. No, unsettling is a better way of putting it. Let me explain. Music is an important part of a film, right? It gives us the musical cues on how to feel, and makes it easier for our monkey brains to understand context. Well, Dracula only has two scenes with music, the title screen and the theatre scene. As the silent era of movies ended in 1927 with the film The Jazz Singer, talkies started to become the norm from 1927 to 1930. Dracula was released in 1931, so it was well into the talkie era. But there are a few potential reasons why the film is so quiet. 1. Universal was a late adopter to sound, and the lack of available technology at the time meant they just didn't add musical underscores. 2. Universal believed it would be too jarring for the audience to hear music without a visual source, like a record player or orchestra on screen. Finally, the Great Depression began in 1929 and Universal was struggling financially. So, to keep the budget low, they opted to use pre-existing music and not have a costly composer write a score for the rest of the film. Speaking of financial difficulties, sets and locations are costly, so Dracula used painted backdrops, but they are amazing. Even if they were trying to save money, there's a level of detail in this film that is commendable, like, for example, this little bug coffin. You would not believe how much I want one. So, does Dracula have any other hidden meaning or social commentary, like George Romero movies? Well, this is unverified and simply my opinion, but the Dracula-Renfield dynamic is a bit of an allegory for rich versus poor. Dracula uses his influence and makes promises to Renfield of a better life, filled with all the things he wants to get him to do what he wants. Renfield can't help but chase the metaphorical carrot on a stick, even if part of him knows he's been lied to. There's a great scene in the movie where Dracula walks through a giant spider web without disturbing it. Renfield has to break through the web, almost as if he's a fly ensnared by the spider. If their dynamic isn't meant to be symbolic of the difference in class, perhaps Renfield is meant to represent an addict, always wanting more, always progressing to the next level, even at his own detriment. In this case, flies to spiders to birds and so on, until he would find himself murdering people. The Universal Classic Dracula series consists of Dracula, Dracula Spanish version, which is essentially the same film shot in the same locations but at night, with Spanish-speaking actors and about 30 minutes of additional content along with some other tweaks. This was thought to be lost media until 1990 when a copy was found. Dracula's Daughter, Son of Dracula, House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. There were a couple of attempts to bring Dracula back into the public view since the classic era, with the 1979 Dracula remake with Frank Langella, Van Helsing in 2004 starring Hugh Jackman and Richard Roxburgh, and finally Dracula Untold, which was released in 2014, which was a truer to history reboot of sorts with actor Luke Evans as Vlad Tepes. Researching Dracula media is a bit of a pain in the neck since the book became public domain in 1962, but within the DCU, there's a few standout movies I'd like to just cover briefly. Nosferatu is a silent era, unauthorized and unofficial German adaptation. It also had a remake called Nosferatu the Vampire, or Nosferatu Phantom der Nacht in 1979 that's pretty good. The 1922 Nosferatu starred Max Schreck as the vampire himself, and may actually be the first on-screen adaptation of the Dracula novel. Dracula looks his most disturbing and monstrous in this film, and is renamed Count Orlok to be legally distinct. Which didn't work as the Stoker estate went after the film anyway, winning the legal battle, and all copies of the film had to be destroyed. Thankfully, the movie survived somehow, and is still available to watch to this day. Argyle Goolsby of Blitzkid fame rescored the original black and white version of this film back in 2020, which is really good. You should also check out his solo work, Spiders and Flies, or the Blitzkid song Nosferatu for your next horror punk fix. Hammer Horror is a British film company founded in 1934, and they gave Dracula a good crack too. If Lugosi is the master of menace, Christopher Lee is the prince of darkness. He embodied Dracula with the same gravitas as his predecessor, owning the character in his own way. But Christopher Lee deserves a video all to himself, so I'll stop gushing. For now. Also of note, you can find another famous British actor here too. Peter Cushing's as Van Helsing. Moff Tarkin from Star Wars, anyone? The Hammer Horror movies starring Dracula are Dracula, The Brides of Dracula, Dracula, Prince of Darkness, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, Taste the Blood of Dracula, Scars of Dracula, Dracula AD 1972, The Satanic Rites of Dracula, The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. Due to Dracula being public domain, I could sit here all night listing off all the related films, books, comics, and other media I could find. But I think that's enough for now. After all, 2023 seems to be the year of the bat, with Renfield being released and the last voyage of the Demeter due out soon, so there's definitely scope for another Dracula video in the future. For now, let's get back to the classic version that inspired the video to begin with, and the leading man himself. Born Bela Lugosi on 20th October 1882, just west of the Transylvanian Alps, which is pretty fitting when you think about it, in a town called Lugos in Hungary. This is where we start our story. In the early 1900s, Aristide Olt, as he was calling himself, had become a reputable actor. By 1913, he'd become a member of the National Theatre of Budapest, where he was highly regarded for his versatility. Remember that word, versatility. Now, quick history lesson. The First World War happened between 1914 and 1918. Lesson over. Thanks for coming. Hungary was in turmoil, and they declared independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918, which created an internal rift in the country. After the country became independent, there was a communist revolution which ousted the government. Lugosi sided with the communists to spread the good message within the community of actors, but when the new communist regime itself was replaced, Lugosi found himself blacklisted from every state theatre. This ended the first leg of his acting career. So in 1919, to nobody's surprise, he found himself fleeing the country. Hiding under bales of hay, he fled to Vienna and then Berlin. By 1921, he had made it to Ellis Island in America, and the second leg of his acting career began. Everybody has heard the rumour that Lugosi learnt his lines for Dracula phonetically. This is technically not true. It was actually the play The Red Puppy, which was his first English-speaking role. At this time, he did both theatre and film gigs, gaining a reputation for his versatility. Again with that word, versatility. It's almost like a bad omen. Finally, in 1927, he got his now iconic role as Dracula on Broadway. 33 weeks on Broadway and 2 years of touring, and the man was synonymous with his character. So what next? Well, Lugosi wanted to be Dracula for the big screen too. You can tell the man was rabid for the role, as he willingly agreed to a contract paying him $500 a week. Comparing this to David Manners, who played Jonathan Harker, Lugosi was paid only a quarter of what Manners was paid, and he was the star. He also went above and beyond his position for the film too. Before he was even cast, he negotiated with the Stoker estate to lower their asking price for the movie rights. He did this unpaid for 2 months and managed to get the price down from $200,000 to somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000. It is a shame he didn't use that bargaining skill on his own contract. It is reported that he would prepare for shooting by walking around in full Dracula attire, repeating, "I am Dracula," over and over and over. If you watch the movie closely, you will notice that Dracula never blinks once. It's little touches like this that add to his performance. That and his infamous stare. With the worldwide success of Dracula, Universal Studios teamed Lugosi with fellow actor Boris Karloff. Stick a stake in this, we'll be coming back to it later. When he wasn't playing Dracula, Lugosi was playing Dracula-like characters, or being directed to play them as such. He longed to break free of his magnum opus, but unfortunately, in many cases, it was either Dracula or nothing. Fortunately, at least outwardly, he was able to keep a sense of humour about it, saying, "I discovered that every producer in Hollywood has definitely set me down as a type, an actor of this particular kind of role. Considering that before Dracula, I had never, in a long and varied career on the stage of 2 continents, played anything but leads and straight characters, I was both amused and bitterly disappointed." By the late 1940s, he was reduced to low-quality B-movies which had damaged his brand, and his substance use had become well documented. It looked like the end for Lugosi, but then, seemingly out of nowhere, his career got a much-needed shot in the arm when he reprised his role in the film Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Yes, He was back to portraying the Count, but it was finally a high-budget production. Maybe this would be the film that brought his career back from the shadows and into the spotlight. Tragically, he almost missed out on this opportunity, as the producers thought he was dead. He was eventually cast in the parody, but it was a low point for him personally, and it didn't do his career the good he thought it would. Interestingly, earlier in 1940, the Disney film Fantasia, guess which role Lugosi played? Yes, he was the live-action reference footage for the demon Chernobog in the Night on Bald Mountain sequence. Let's go back to Boris Karloff, born William Henley Pratt in England in 1887, not fitting the typical movie star mould and suffering from a lisp and stuttering problems. It is a surprise he went on to be one of the biggest names in Hollywood. 1931 was the year of the monster, with both Lugosi and Karloff starring in their own horror movies. Dracula being released first in the February, as Frankenstein came out in the November. There is a lot of speculation about the rivalry between the two men. Some say that Lugosi was supposed to play the monster in Karloff's Frankenstein, with insiders saying he turned down the role because it was a non-speaking part, and the makeup would hide his identity. Other rumours are that Lugosi didn't do well at the screening test, and that was partially due to his lack of understanding English, although I would dispute this claim, as he spoke English well enough for Dracula, and Frankenstein had no speaking parts for him. 1931 came and went, with both men becoming household names, largely thanks to the monster hits they portrayed that year. It was inevitable then that the two men would have to share the limelight at some point, and preferably get along doing so. They shared the screen on 8 separate occasions, that being The Black Cat, Gift of the Gab, The Raven, The Invisible Ray, Son of Frankenstein, Black Friday, You'll Find Out, and The Body Snatcher, all of which Karloff's name was either top billing or at the very least equal billing to Lugosi. The truth of the matter is that the two men actually had a good on-screen relationship that perhaps bordered on friendship. They were respectful on set, and there were no reports of any issues off camera either. That said, you can understand if there was professional competition between the two, always fighting for the same roles or top billing against the other. It is said that there was jealousy from Lugosi until his death towards Karloff, due to the difference in their staying power and how he had become typecast as the Count, whereas Karloff had been able to pursue a more varied career. But this was never directed towards his contemporary, unlike the portrayal of him in the 1994 Ed Wood biopic. The only other reason I can see for this rivalry could have been to drum up a media circus when launching their next blockbuster, but this is just speculation. In 1951, Lugosi returned for a final time to reprise the role of Dracula on stage. Unfortunately, this would not be the swan song he envisioned for himself. At 68 years old, he was not the Dracula he once was. He began dropping cues and saying the wrong lines, and after 20 weeks on tour, that would be the end of his time in the ever-fading spotlight. It is well documented that he was unable to manage his money, and he had a taste for the expensive things in life. He often teetered on the edge of bankruptcy due to the spending habits and addictions. But the charity of others often pulled him through. One such person being the famous crooner Frank Sinatra, who is bizarrely often credited as paying for Lugosi's funeral, which is not true. By the end of his career, Lugosi had been reduced to a shadow of his former self, commenting in one interview, "Now I am the boogeyman." In 1955, at his lowest point, he checked himself into a psychiatric ward and was soon committed to the state ward at his request. It was here that he would read the infamous script from Ed Wood, which would be his last ever role, and receive a letter from Hope Lininger, a fan who, when he was released, would become his 5th and final wife. Interestingly, by the end of his life he'd had more brides than Dracula, the longest being 20 years to Lillian Arch, and the shortest a measly 10 days to Beatrice Woodruff Weeks. He'd actually been married 3 times before he got his iconic role as the Count on the big screen. On the 16th of August 1956, at 73 years of age, Lugosi passed away at his home in California due to a heart attack. He was famously buried in his costume and even one of his Dracula capes. What is truly sad is that the people he worked for and the companies he worked for were conspicuously absent from his funeral, most notably Boris Karloff. In 1979, a single called Bela Lugosi is Dead was released by the British pop-punk band Bauhaus. Why is this important, I hear you say? Well, I'll tell you if you sit down and listen. In the band's own words, "We didn't want to write an ode to Bela Lugosi, ostensibly. The kitsch element was his name because he was the biggest icon." Now, if that doesn't sell you on Bela being the quintessential Dracula, I don't know what would. Running with the Universal movie continuity, what if Dracula defeated Van Helsing? What would happen next? Dracula would be unknown in England, and he could walk freely amongst the living without fear. People would have no idea what a vampire was, and even if they did, they wouldn't know how to stop them. They probably would think that it's some Jack the Ripper type of serial killer with a love bite calling card. Before long, vampires would be the dominant life form and take over society from the top, with a ruling class with Dracula as emperor. They'd have to go further afield to find humans to feed on eventually. Vampires would outweigh humans, and the few humans that remained would probably be bred for food. Pretty bleak, right? Oh, you want me to move on to some kind of happy ending where humans reclaim the Earth? Sorry. If that were possible, you'd have to wait until the sequel to find out. I didn't expect to get this deep into Dracula, but I guess I really sunk my teeth into this one. We've talked of monsters and men, novels and movies, fact and fiction, life and death. But how does Dracula relate to my previous video about Night of the Living Dead? Let me know in the comments below what you think. And while you're there, tell me what your favourite interpretation of Dracula is. And so, with all that said, thank you for your time. I wish you a good day, and many more besides. Yours, forever in horror, 226.
He's crazy.
They're all crazy. They're all crazy except you and me. Sometimes I have me doubts about you.
Yes,